It was the worst possible news for any Rush fan. On January 7th, Neil Peart, the band's virtuoso drummer and lyricist, passed away from brain cancer at the age of 67, putting to rest once and for all any chance of Rush reforming. Now a new book looks into the first decade of the band, from their humble beginnings in suburban Toronto to the release of 1978's Hemispheres, just as they're about to become a true global phenomenon. For more on Anthem, Rush in the 70s, we're joined by author Martin Popoff. Welcome, Martin.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. Very cool.
Now, Martin, as your email signature points out, you are the author of some 85 books, going all the way back to 1993's Riff Kills Man, which I read as a much younger man. I love how you put some autobiographical touches in the reviews of that book, like how Blue Oyster Cult's Fire of Unknown Origin got you through your final year of high school, and you've kind of continued that tradition in this book. So let me ask you, what did Rush mean to a young rock fan like yourself growing up in Trail, BC?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out when I first heard Rush, but I was definitely pretty woke, and on our way with me and a couple of buddies to being quote unquote hard rock experts, even at around 10 or 11 years old. So 74, Rush's first album. Can't remember if I heard it in 74. Can't remember if I heard Caress of Steel in 75 or Fly By Night in 75. But I think my first memory, and knowing that I knew all about Rush by this point, was hearing 2112 on Creme FM out of Spokane, Washington. That was our big town we would go to buy new wave of British heavy metal records and Kerrang and Sounds and all that, and just general shopping trips. But so they were the classic rock station, and they played the entire album, start to finish. And I'm sitting there with trembling two fingers, ready to hit play and record to record the thing. So yeah, already knew about Rush at that point. So they were we all loved that album completely. And then I remember though, because we were so uncompromising, we were a little ticked off that A Farewell to Kings was a little lighter and Hemispheres was okay but still light. Although by that point, it's taken over. I'm taking drums a lot more seriously by that point, so I'm into it for the progginess and the technicality of it by that point. But I do remember a little disappointment in A Farewell to Kings not being that heavy.
Now, one of the interesting parts of the Rush story is how they were basically an indie band in that no one would sign them. What was that about?
Yeah, I mean, they took a long time. They paid their dues. They paid their dues twice, really. I mean, they paid their dues even after they were working, recording artists that most of us would consider, quote unquote rock stars. So they paid their dues probably from about 74 to 78 before they kind of started really getting a little bigger and eventually making some money. But before 74, they essentially were a pretty serious band for almost 5 years at that point, or call it 3.5 or 4 years. But so they had no deal, and they essentially even for the first album. Now this ended pretty quickly, but for the first album, basically the management office, Ray Daniels, invented a label for them and put out the first album as an indie. So that's in 74. I think it's March 74. But they very quickly get signed by Mercury in the States, and they're on their way. But worse than even the indie band aspect. You're right. I guess they were an indie band for a very short period there. But they spent quite a long time just even getting to that point. Although most of it was more or less playing close in and around the home area of Toronto and Ontario and that. But yeah, they paid their dues then, and they paid their dues later too. But and the indie band period, fortunately, didn't last too long.
Now, CanCon was already around for a few years when Rush started out, but it wasn't much help to them. In fact, they broke the U.S. first, specifically Cleveland.
Yeah, so what happened was, Donna Halper down there and the influential radio station started playing. I think she talks about Working Man and Finding My Way, and people were calling in and saying, "Wow, is this the new Led Zeppelin album? Very cool." because you think about it, I guess Led Zeppelin was a year away. You know, they hadn't had an album for a while. It would have been House of the Holy before that. But Geddy sounded, you know, people superficially anyways, people thought Geddy sounded a little bit like Robert Plant. I don't really think so. I think he had some Robert Plant mannerisms then, just only on that album more or less, but he doesn't, I don't think his voice sounds like Robert Plant. But the band itself, you know, was a hard-hitting blues/heavy metal band. So, you know, the sum total of that first album, you know, sounds somewhat like Led Zeppelin. And back then you didn't have as much information as you have now, right? So they basically broke out of there. And eventually Cliff Bernstein, who's, you know, he's represented in the book fairly extensively, he finds out about them and signs them to Mercury, and then they're down there, and the first things they do, I guess they're playing Backing Up Your Eye Heap and playing sort of, you know, they become this Midwestern band, and they kind of stay that way right to the end, even though they became a global thing. It's this meat and potatoes area of the Rust Belt that basically broke them. So their earlier shows are, you know, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, that sort of thing. But yeah, and as soon as this happened, they just jumped into the States, and they essentially hammered the States even harder than they even hit their own country.
Now, the other crazy thing to me about the Rush saga, if you will, is that by the time Neil Peart comes into the picture, he had all but given up his dreams of rock stardom. He was back home at St. Catharines, working at the family business, basically selling farm equipment for his dad.
Yeah, and he had that demoralizing time in London where he goes there and he's just completely broke, and he finds it so hard to get a gig, and eventually gives up. You know, he's already had a couple of bands back home, so yeah, he goes back and he starts working for his dad again, and he's doing a great job. I mean, Neil, you know, had this great, good, solid, dependable personality, very congenial guy, and basically he was doing good there. And then essentially Rush decided that they can't carry on with John Rutsey. He's not taking care of himself. He's a diabetic. He's partying too hard. He's got some personality quirks that are bothering him, and that's kind of covered in the book about this. You know, he would ostracize people and basically start, you know, little dramas, I guess, between people. And then at that point, you know, one of the interesting things is Rush does try to poach Paul Kersey, Max Webster's drummer, but they find out about Neil, and Neil eventually shows up. I think he says it's his family brown Pinto or whatever, throws all his drums in there and goes off to Toronto and does this in the East End, does this audition, I suppose, and they just looked at each other and they just could not believe how good this guy was, and then they just hit it off right away. They had the same sense of humor, talking about books and Monty Python, I believe, and stuff like that, and basically they decided, like, this is going to change us, and it totally did.
I like that you bring up Max Webster just now, because I think one of the great lines in the book comes from Kim Mitchell, who talks about what would have happened had Neil not joined Rush. And I'm paraphrasing, but he basically predicts them having penned a bunch of In the Mood type songs, Hey Baby, It's a 7:45, before fizzling out.
Yeah, that's the big thing. I mean, Neil, obviously, he becomes their lyricist of basically 99% of everything they're going to do, and he really helps transform or unlock Geddy's progressive rock tendencies, and drags Alex along there too, because Alex is kind of still liking this bluesy stuff and Led Zeppelin and all this, but basically he over time turns those guys into the Renaissance men they became, and all three of them were Renaissance men in the end. They had a lot of interests, and they were all learned guys into a lot of different things. So I think that was Neil's big catalyst. I mean, there's the music end of it, and which you notice immediately on Fly By Night. I mean, they become a much more note-dense progressive band, essentially inventing a new genre of music called progressive metal. I mean, it's literally taking progressive rock and metal and jamming them together, or you could almost say it's like progressive rock with a distortion pedal on it, right? And so he's a huge catalyst in that, and then his literary side, I think, even by proxy, caused them to raise their game in all things, just in terms of their personalities, let alone what they were doing with the music.
Now, I know this isn't the first time you've written about Rush. There's the book from a few years back called Contents Under Pressure. But did you come to have a new appreciation for the band going over their early history again like this?
Yeah, because I'd say that's an interesting question. I would say the answer would have to be more so because of the inspiration I got from writing this Clash and this Led Zeppelin book I had to do, which are very proud of these. They're the kind of like all I had to literally write about every single song in 400 or 500 words of the entire catalogs of those two bands, and that caused me to take that approach into this book and analyze a lot more. Plus, I used outside press. Plus, I have this. There's part of the reason this book exists. A bit of a long story, but I worked on the Rush movie at the research end of things with, and then transcribing later, which is important. With Banger Films on this Beyond the Lighted Stage. And we struck a deal that I was able to use the stuff that we didn't use in the movie because you collect so much along the way. So because Contents Under Pressure it was an authorized biography, is the first one that I did of these Rush books long time ago, with ECW, who also became Neil Peart's publisher, because the idea was to update that original book and make it much better and bigger, and it was kind of the quote-unquote official publisher, sort of. And, we all had a good relationship with the office, and Peggy's awesome, and Jack knows Peggy, Jack at ECW, so everything's cool there. And so we put this together to do this. So yeah, bit of a long story of all the stuff that kind of goes into this, but to answer your question, I think the appreciation side of it comes from having to be that Buddhist up on the mountain writing about every single song by Led Zeppelin and Clash, and somewhat applying that to Rush, like putting on the headphones and kind of like going through the songs a lot more deeply.
Now, this is the first in a series of Rush books. I imagine book number 2 will be the 80s, and then number 3 will be the 90s and beyond. What can readers look forward to in those next 2 books?
Yeah, so when I first approached ECW and had all this kind of wealth of material that we were going to, turn the first book into one big book, Contents Under Pressure on steroids, as I started writing it, I realized I had enough for 3 books here as I started kind of mapping everything out. 3 pretty long books, actually. Second one's called Limelight, Rush in the 80s, and the third one is called Driven, Rush in the 90s, and in quote marks, in the end. So it takes us right up to the end of the band at that point. So yeah, new characters come in, new producers, new engineers. You hear from them, new bands that they toured with, all that kind of stuff too. Along the way, so you get wherever your Rush fandom falls down, and frankly for most Rush fans it's all three eras, I suppose. There's basically the very academic and involved examination of every single damn album.
Well, there you go. I commented on one of your Contrarians entries when you guys did Signals, and I said that's my favorite, so I'm looking forward to book 2 as well.
Yeah, cool. Yes, it's my favorite Rush album, yeah.
And what's the timeline on those next 2 books?
Limelight comes out October of this year, 2020, and then Driven will come out spring. Book publishing kind of breaks into these 2 halves of a year, so exactly this time again in 2021.
All right, great stuff. Love talking about this. I could all day, in fact. The name of the book is Anthem, Rush in the 70s, and it's available from ECW Press. My thanks again to author Martin Popoff.
Yes, thank you, John. Very cool.